Have you ever imagined God asking something that shatters every idea you have about honor, justice, and mercy? What would you do if a divine command asked you to love publicly someone the whole town had already thrown away? Stay with me, because in the next minutes you will be led to the heart of God in a way that may unsettle your comforts and expand your mercy. Picture the scene now. The sun presses down on sun-baked stones. The air tastes of roasted grain. Dust rises with every footstep, and the market noise hums like a restless sea. You can feel the heat on your neck, hear a child cry in the distance, smell oil and sweat, and see the shadow of a figure moving through the crowd. The protagonist of this story was more than a man. He was chosen to become a living sermon, a mirror for a nation that had turned its face from God. Then the voice came like thunder and like a whisper at once, a command impossible to rationalize. "Listen," the Lord said. "Go take to yourself a woman known for betrayal and know that her life will declare the state of a people. Remain with this story until the end, because I will give you a truth about grace that will press against your assumptions and call you to act." This is not merely the personal tragedy of one marriage. It is a portrait of the heart of the Lord who pays the price to restore the lost. Now follow the first step of this strange calling into a town that knows shame better than mercy. The mandate landed like a stone in a still pond, and the ripples could not be contained. The command was direct and stark, echoing the ancient line in Hosea 1:2, yet it felt new and raw in the chest of the man who heard it. He repeated the words aloud in a quiet room to a friend named Eliab, who sat on a low bench and looked at him with wide, sympathetic eyes. The prophet said, "I do not understand, Lord, why this would expose prayers and reputation." Eliab replied, "It will expose not only them, but us all. Tell me what you will do." Jonah, who lived next door, came in from the alley and placed a hand on the prophet's shoulder and said, "Maybe God wants the city to see what mercy looks like." Miriam, the seamstress who often mended the prophet's robe, whispered, "Do not let fear decide for you." The contrast was immediate. The divine decree cut through social logic and left a single, clear direction. That public call to a private kind of love created the first moral fracture and set the whole narrative rolling like a cart down a hill. When he found her, the encounter was not cinematic. It was ordinary and brutal in its normality. The woman stood by a well, the rope frayed beneath her. Fingers the water, reflecting a sky that held no pity. Her name in the neighborhood was known and scorned. They called her Leah, though later people would remember other names she had been given over the years. The first sensory images of their meeting were sharp. The rope smelled of river mud. Her hair tasted of the breeze. Her clothes were patched and smelled faintly of fennel and smoke. And the sound of a hammer in a nearby workshop punctuated each silence. He spoke first. "Are you the woman they say you are?" She looked up with tired eyes and answered truthfully, "Yes," and then asked, "Are you the one God sent to me?" He said, "I have been told to love you and to live as if your life tells the story of a people." There were 4 short exchanges, then 2 longer shifts in which she asked, "Why me?" And he replied, "Because what is done to you is done to many, and your life will teach what mercy costs." Rebecca, a neighbor, watched from a doorstep, and Amos, a market vendor, crossed himself when he saw the exchange. The scene was not private. It was a stage framed by gossip, by pity, and by the clink of coins in a distant chest. Their union became a public parable, and the first signs of prophecy followed quickly, like children born with names that tasted of judgment. They married in a courtyard under the watchful eyes of Sarah, a housekeeper, and Caleb, an elder, who read aloud the text that described covenant and cost. The first child was named Silence, to mark the hush that had fallen over complaints. The second child received another strange name that signified coming consequences, and the town murmured at each syllable. At the well, a group of women led by Hannah pointed fingers, while a carpenter named Daniel and a scribe named Tobias debated whether this was obedience or spectacle. The symbolism was raw, and the neighbors would not allow it to be subtle. The prophet taught the children small lessons about mercy and about bread, and the upturned faces of the little ones became an image that circulates in the market like a coin that cannot be spent. People asked, "What does this mean for us?" And the prophet replied in a voice that trembled yet held firm, "This marriage is a living proclamation that our nation has betrayed its covenant." The name of God was spoken there often, not as accusation, but as the signpost of hope. Pain came as predictably as night. The woman drifted, sometimes into the streets with a look that said she belonged to no man, and the town responded with contempt. Children stared, and boys threw stones. The prophet felt each thrash of shame like a knife, a public humiliation not easily forgotten. There were nights when he stood by the door and heard the people whisper, "Why does he endure such disgrace?" And he answered to himself, "Because mercy will be taught by example, even when it breaks the teacher." In the square, a crowd took to calling out, and Sarah, who once brought bread to their table, now would not cross the street. Caleb, who used to speak kindly, would keep his face down. The suffering was layered, one sting upon another, a humiliation performed openly that cut through private faith and public image. The memory of a neighbor named Jonah, who had once been a friend, now mocking from a rooftop, became a recurring ache. These moments of betrayal were deep, the sting compacted into 2 short paragraphs of inward wrestling, where he questioned if obedience was a foolish vanity, and then returned to prayer, because the Lord had shown him the shape of redemption in a vision by the olive trees. The internal crisis included a flash memory of his mother cautioning him never to offer dignity without certainty, and an encounter with a child who reached for the woman's hand despite the scorn around them. That child said, "She is like my mother," and in that sentence, the prophet's resolve was both tested and renewed. Silence fell like winter, and the prophet entered a season of waiting that smelt of cedar and old parchment. Nights were long, and the sky offered no answer. He wrote letters that he never sent, and one night sat with Miriam, who read to him psalms until his shoulders unclenched. He learned to listen in the empty hours to the sound of a lamp guttering. There were 3 separate stretches of solitude, each shaping him differently. In the first, he felt betrayed by God because obedience brought pain. In the second, he remembered the faces of those labeled outcasts, the widow, the Samaritan, the profligate, and recognized familiar features in the wife. In the third, he came to see silence as a teacher of patience, a clearing where mercy could be replanted. He kept a small clay cup under his bed and sometimes would press it to his lips as if to taste a promise. During these months, the prophet spoke to a traveling priest named Hanan, who told stories about the cross currents of judgment and grace. The waiting was not idle. It was a proving field where faith was tested and where compassion was clarified into a fierce, steady resolve. Then came the deepest moment of tension, when the woman left and the community cheered her absence. The pain of abandonment was like a physical wound, and the prophet felt the city breathe a sigh of approval that wounded him even more. He went into the market of Nazareth, now a place of transactional hearts, where a man named Joel bartered the woman like a commodity and asked for a price. The prophet approached Joel and said, "Will you sell her for what they offered?" Joel scoffed and asked who would pay what she is worth. They traded words, they argued about value, and the scene contained 6 terse exchanges that each revealed something about justice and price. The prophet said, "I will buy her back with the coins of mercy," and Joel laughed, and said, "Mercy has no weight in my scales." A crowd gathered. Miriam and Rebekah both stood by and watched as he counted out tokens, while Jonah, the scoffer, spat words meant to shame. The air tasted metallic, the coins clanged like accusation, and the noise of the crowd felt like waves pressing against a shore. That pressure made the moment taut, the decision poised between collapse and rescue. He offered more than coin, he offered himself. And in that offering, there was a theology enacted, a visible payment of redemption for a soul rejected by society. The short memory of that exchange clings to the heart like an old scar, and it is one of the moments the town remembers when they tell this story to their children. The marketplace redemption unfolded with concrete details. The seller counted coins and stroked his beard. Tobias, who recorded transactions in a small notebook, watched closely and then rose to call a witness. The woman hesitated. She tasted bread and iron on her lips. Her hands shook from the memory of nights on cold stones. The prophet said, "You are coming home." And she asked, "Will there be forgiveness?" And he answered, "There is always room at the table, and because grace precedes merit." There were 5 to 6 short exchanges in this key scene that rendered the theology into human language. Amos, the vendor, who earlier had crossed himself, now stepped forward to support the prophet by placing a loaf of bread in the woman's hands. The smell of warm bread, mixed with the metallic clang of coins, made the moment feel sacramental. Rebekah offered her cloak to cover the woman's shoulders, and Sarah wiped a tear with a cloth that smelled of lavender. The rescue was not a secret. It was a public transaction, and the price paid was both literal and a symbol of the ransom Jesus would later make known. The town began to murmur again, but this time some murmurs turned to questions that invited reflection, not condemnation. It is at this point that the theological lens widens and the narrative opens into exposition and connection to Christ and redemption principles. The marriage and the marketplace are prophetic acts pointing to a God whose method of rescue is costly and personal. The prophet had enacted in bread and coin the theology that Jesus would embody when he offered himself as the ransom for many. The book of Hosea and its strange marriage becomes a portrait of the wider covenant of redemption, of a people who have chased idols and lost their way. Here we name the themes: grace, forgiveness, mercy, redemption, sacrifice, covenant, and reconciliation, and we allow them to resonate in the bones of the story. A theologian named Pastor Eli frequently came to teach. He explained that the purchase in the market is emblematic of God's economy, where price is paid not to earn favor, but to restore relationship. A visiting scholar called Miriam taught that the child's name, Silence, is a reminder that God can speak through what the world ignores. Each interpretation does not diminish the painful human reality, it illuminates it. When the prophet read aloud scripture and spoke of Jesus, he did not replace the woman's story. He fulfilled its meaning. The act of buying back the rejected shows what God does when he turns toward the unfaithful and says, "Return, and I will take you back." Theological terms were not abstractions in this town. They were embodied in bread, in coins, and in the steady presence of a man who chose shame for the sake of a people. If this part of the story has touched you, take a breath. And if you felt that sting of recognition, write below in the comments one word, either unfaithful or called. And in one sentence, tell us which role you have felt in your spiritual journey. Your brief testimony could be exactly the encouragement someone else needs. Do not be afraid. Your story matters, and your comment will help shape conversations about mercy that we must keep having. Your community here is not a jury. It is a group trying to learn what it means to love when love looks costly. After you share, keep listening, because what follows is the rippling consequence of mercy when it meets resistance and yet refuses to yield to shame. The remainder of the narrative shows the aftermath. The prophet continued to teach the children to greet strangers. The woman learned to sit at the table and taste food without flinching. And the town slowly noticed that the presence of mercy created small shifts in behavior. Some names that had been sharp became softer over time. And Jonah, who mocked, finally brought his child to the prophet for blessing. Hannah, the woman who once pointed fingers, began to give bread to a widow down the street. The story makes clear that redemption is not immediate, it is gradual and often contested. The prophet spoke about the cross before it was known in its fullness, and in doing so, he connected the ancient act to the coming work of Jesus, the one who would ultimately pay with his blood a price for many. This interpretation became a bridge. The pastor Eli stood on to teach that reconciliation demands payment, and that the payment God chooses is love that refuses to walk away. The vocabulary, grace, forgiveness, mercy, redemption, sacrifice, reconciliation appeared again and again as people tried to speak the new language of restored relationship. Now consider application. Where are you in this story? Are you holding the coins waiting to purchase someone back? Or are you the one who has been labeled and left to the market square? The invitation is practical. Forgive someone who does not deserve it. Volunteer to restore a name that the community has injured. Come to a church bench and let someone pray with you. Mercy is not sentimental. It is costly, and it asks for real gestures of rescue. Community matters, so find a circle that will help you practice reconciliation, not merely talk about it. If you are carrying shame, you are invited to bring it to the feet of the Lord who says, "Return to me, and I will take you back." That is the divine promise and the pastoral request. Sign up for the small group that will study these themes and bring a friend who needs to hear that the heart of God is more persistent than our failures. Epigraph to Living Hope. 1 month later. The small gestures of kindness had begun to alter routines. The woman, now known again by her given name, Leah, woke earlier to sweep the courtyard and to lay out bread pieces for the children. There were awkward moments. She would flinch when greeted, but the prophet and Miriam learned to be patient. Caleb, who had once crossed the street to avoid them, now helped repair the roof after a rain. And Tobias recorded small reconciliations in his notebook as if to prove that change could be counted. Conversations at the well shifted from derision to curiosity, and Joel, the seller, nodded once as if to mark a private surrender. 1 month felt fragile, but it contained invincible seeds because forgiveness had gone from theory to practice. 3 months later, deeper patterns emerged. The children played together without adults shouting warnings. Sarah shared a basin of soup with Leah, and the prophet taught a new class in the evening about covenant care. Jonah brought his son to learn the Psalms, and Amos opened a stall with a sign that read, "Welcome." The marketplace that once traded shame now hosted conversations about mercy, and people began to ask how they might be instruments of rescue beyond their town. The pastor Eli reported that several who had been dismissed from fellowship were invited back to sit at the table. The town did not become perfect, yet the horizon showed signs of recovery as acts of repair multiplied and began to outweigh acts of scorn. 6 months on, the change had a shape recognized by people beyond their walls. Travelers passing through spoke of a community where the outcast was being welcomed, and a small network of neighboring villages began to emulate simple practices of ransom and restoration. The prophet looked at his hands one evening and remembered the first command that had felt like a wound and now tasted like a hymn. Leah taught a young mother to mend cloth, and Tobias began to copy down the stories of reconciliation into a little book to be read by others. The epilogue is not a tidy ending. It is a testimony that redemption persists when a people decide to pay the cost. Restoration. The phrase, "Return to me, and I will take you back," hangs over their daily rhythms like a banner, not of triumph, but of patient, faithful work. If this narrative moved you, share it with someone who needs to know that no fall is beyond the reach of a God who pays the price. Subscribe to receive more stories that translate Scripture into lived mercy and join a community that practices redemptive love. Remember this final thought: no fall is too deep for the love that pays the price.